Today's special. Today's different. We're doing something different here at Hall Pass to Nowhere. This is a special edition. Today, I am honored to be joined by Karim Ali and Sadiq Ali. They are the visionaries and the directors, producers. Am I correct or am I wrong on that part? Correct.
Right on.
Behind the documentary, They Said Niggas Don't Read, The Rise and Fall of the Black Bookstore. So I got to be honest with you fellas. Before I hopped on, I debated back and forth whether I was going to say that N-word in that title. Not going to lie to you. I debated back and forth. And ultimately, I read it. I guess I felt like just, it's in the title. I'm going to read it. But the title directly confronts a racist stereotype. So what is the intended reaction you want from the audience when they first read it?
Nah, I appreciate that, bro. I'll go ahead and lead off and I'll toss it to Karim because he and I, Brother Timothy, number one, we just appreciate your platform. And again, as we said before we started recording, just what this platform represents, what you all have done with it, bro. Just much love for the invitation to come on to speak. Just wanted to get that out of the way, but really appreciate the opening question because it's like, we can't go no place else until we go there first. And so it's like, let's address the elephant in the room, which is not the title. The elephant in the room is actually global white supremacy. But that's another conversation for another day, of which this title is simply a part of. But the couple beats that I'll say on the title, then I'll toss it to Karim. It's like, first, I want to be clear that we are not the visionaries behind this project. The creator is the visionary behind this project, and we are the conduits. We are simply the vessels. And the title, my brother, is no different in that. Shortly after, or should I say, maybe a year or two after, I was hit with the inspiration to tell this story and to honor my father's legacy, who, hopefully we'll get to share a little bit more about. The title came to me like a bolt of lightning. And I believe that the title was God-given. It was divine inspiration. And what I took from that divine inspiration, my brother, to your question around like, what do we want folks to feel? My take on what the creator wanted us to communicate is that we are in a moment where we've gotten really, really comfortable, my brother. And so this title is meant to jar. It's meant to provoke. It's meant to make folks uncomfortable. It's meant to shock in a way that very little has shock value these days, unless you're of the utmost extreme, either one side of the spectrum or the other. And so I want to open with that. The only other things that I will say is that along with the title, because we understand the visceral nature of that word, the painful legacy, the history, and what we've done in turn with that word as people of African descent, we've taken that word like many other things and made sugar out of what, should I say. And so the title is also meant to spur conversation around the legacy of that word, right? And sort of what it means in the context of that stereotype that you called out, which we know there's some truth to a lot of stereotypes, and there's also some falsehood and some stereotypes. So all of that, my brother, is built in, it's nuanced, it's layered. We want folks to lead and have that conversation. This is even before you get to the content of the actual project. But all of that was laid in and intentional with the title. And I want Karim to sort of speak on not just from his vantage point, but also like the they said part is also a critical element of that title as well. And so that's kind of my piece, but I'll toss it to Karim to add in.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So as I had said in an earlier conversation I was having in a class with a filmmaker colleague today, that it's been a number of years that Sadiq and I have actually worked on this project together. And we've had many conversations in that same deliberation that you mentioned. Hey, do I even say this, or how do I say it? And going back and forth. And so I believe that if you were to say, well, are you at peace, with the language? Are you at peace with how it's actually going to be received? I would say no, in a sense for myself. No, I'm not at peace with that, because I do understand the history of the word. I'm beginning to understand even and more so. Unfortunately, I hadn't been at the end of a shotgun or, some other weapon that was meant to kill me, with the last thing on me being described as is a nigga before the bullet is left the chamber, or, or before the assassination took place. We got to understand that that's what we were called. That word nigger, well, however you want to phrase it, use the letter It was a caricature that was actually put upon our people. That's not who we were. That's not who we are. And so understand that Sadiq and I actually, we honor the past and we honor all those that actually died before us at the moment when those words were used to actually describe us. And it is a way of actually jolting us into the need to have a conversation, and not just about that word itself, but in terms of how we're perceived in this world and what are we going to do about it in that sense. Now, on the other side of it, it is a word that actually gets your attention. It is a phrase that actually gets your attention. And we didn't want to necessarily run with the sensationalism of it. Hence, over our deliberation, what was given to me, the title was given to Sadiq, but what was given to me was context, on the context of they said. That's not what we called ourselves. And if you look in history, at one point in America's history, it was codified in law that it was a crime to teach, a soulfully indigenous Black person to read. It was a crime. You could actually get killed, right? And so we've read, as Baba Nati, one of our participants that you'll see in the film, says, and it'll be a famous quote, that we read. We've always read. And he goes to say that thing about putting information in a book to hide it from a Black man is false. It's a myth. It's a fable.
I believe that specific part you're talking about, that's in the trailer, right? Because I feel like I viewed that part specifically. Wow.
And bro, let me add in one more piece about the title, right? Because this conversation is going to be an ongoing conversation for as long, Lord willing, as the project is on top of folks' mind. Like, this conversation, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But what I will say very practically, both for you, Brother Timothy, as well as audience members, folks that are going to come across the project, we also, again, recognize the pain of the word. And also, again, we don't want and are not co-signing our allies or non-Black folks that don't have a legacy attached to the word. We aren't co-signing folks saying that word either, to be clear. And so the sort of additional sort of secondary title, if you will, is the NDR project. And, we offer that to folks as an alternative, as an out, to be able to, again, reference the title of the project. And then secondly, really quickly, and this is actually a big one, is that we recently actually updated, amended, changed the subtitle of the project at the behest of some of our core subjects and participants in the project, namely Baba Nati and Baba Paul Coates. And so the rise and fall of the Black Bookstore, we were challenged on, and that we didn't want to Karim's point, sensationalize or lead with a false premise, because Black bookstores have subsisted, they've sustained, despite sabotage, which is one of the things that we want to really expose to this project. But our updated subtitle is The Untold Power of the Black Bookstore, because there was no fall. The Black Bookstore, like many institutions, has flowed and ebbed and gone up and down. And as a matter of fact, we're actually in the midst of a substantial renaissance of Black bookstores as well. And so all of that is going to be in sort of the three parts, the sort of past, present, and future of the institution of the Black Bookstore in our documentary. So I wanted to call that out as well.
And I just wanted to make one last point and let you move us further along. For those that are going to practice the politics of respectability and say, I'm not going to say that word, we get it. However, I was actually in, like I said, a conversation earlier today in class, probably a dozen people. There were no soulfully indigenous Black people in that call. And I ran with the acronym. They said NDR. And they all leaned in after I read the log line and was like, well, what does NDR mean? What does that mean? And so I said, okay. And I'm reading the audience and I said, well, they said niggas don't read. And they all sat back and was like, whoa, that's powerful. And I actually had one of those participants tell me, brother, you need to go hard. This is an expose documentary. Go hard, let them know. So I believe that we'll spend time on this, but I don't think many people are going to really stay with that too long when they understand that we're really here to dispel that myth. And much of the film will actually empower people to have more books in their homes than they've ever had. Because I know that's what's happening to me. I have more books in my home since I started this project than I've had in the past. It's actually going to encourage people to get into this notion of our intellectual pursuit. So it's just sort of an interesting social experiment all at the same time.
What's interesting about that is getting more books in the home, that's actually one of the reasons I was actually attracted to the title. I grew up, my mom was a teacher. God rest her soul. She was a teacher. And growing up, she always made me read. And then left the house and I didn't want to see a book. I didn't want to see a book. You know, I was always reading. And I got to a point in life where I had become stagnant. And I was like, you're not putting nothing in. You're not putting nothing in intellectually. And so I had to go back to kind of starting to read their books, that foundation that my mom initially laid for me. And so that whole part about putting more books in the home, I appreciate that. And I love that. And it kind of goes to this, my next question, beyond informing the viewer that comes across this film, right? What specific habit, new perspective, community effort, what do you hope that the documentary inspires in the Black community?
I love it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. One, to see the through lines from what was attempted in the 60s and in the 70s through the federal government, which we'll explore through declassified files and through the voice and presence, you know, of a scholar in his own right as part of this film, to really understand that history and then draw the through line from that time period to today, when you see advances in those efforts, albeit in a different kind of a way. When we look at museums that have had, or that, you know, have established, you know, these exhibits that really tell, you know, the history, the stinging history, you know, of our past, they're being told that they need to dismantle those exhibits. And a lot of the history is actually being whitewashed. And that goes for even policy. I mean, websites, you go to websites where you had information, you know, about our achievements and our advancements. And so it's like, if we don't, you know, as a people, soulful indigenous people, one, know our history, there's no way that we can stand up for it, you know? And so, you know, understanding that there's a past and there were past efforts that sought to dismantle these spaces and dismantle even the effort to become educated, and that they persist today, I believe that it's really timely. And so in my view, having folks, you know, turned on to that, and then saying, well, look, with that understanding, I'm going to pick up a book and then help them as well to understand how to begin to acquire a love for this pursuit of lifelong learning, and to buy more books, and to then encourage others to read, and to begin to read, you know, to their children at a younger age, and to understand that it's even a great practice to read to your unborn child that's in the womb, and to do all these things, because without knowledge, with education, knowledge, the pursuit of our intellectual gravitas, we'll never be able to uplift ourselves, you know, to the potential that we have. And so that is something that I really believe that the film itself can really begin to spark. There are going to need to be follow-up efforts, you know, to that, but, and at the same time, beginning the conversation. And as well, there'll be a conversation around the use of what they call the N-word and those politics of respectability. And, you know, we can as well have that conversation and agree, disagree, you know, but put it out, you know, in the forefront, you know, for us to intellectually grapple with.
Yeah. I mean, double, triple click everything my big bro just said. I would just add like a framing on that, and then like add one additional element. And so our framing is always like 3 E's. And so what Karim just described, I would call a part of that edutainment. We want to educate and entertain folks through this process, right? We know like you learn more when you like having a good time as well. And we want folks to be entertained and uplifted through the story that we tell, which is our legacy, our history. Like, we help create civilization as people of African descent. And this is something that a lot of folks, we haven't leaned into. And so that edutainment part is critical. That also happens to be the album title of one of my favorite all-time albums from Boogie Down Productions, led by the one and only KRS-One, aka the teacher, who was an avid reader. And so that edutainment piece is absolutely critical. I think that second E Karim spoke to is, again, we want to excite folks about that legacy. We want to excite folks about, you know, what it means to pick up a book. We want to excite folks enough to go and take action and visit a local Black bookstore, pick up a Black author, just really get in tuned into the best of what we have to offer, the best of us. And then the only add, bro, is that we also want folks to be enraged. We know that James Baldwin told us, like, paraphrase, to be a person of a Black person of consciousness in America, is essentially to be perpetually enraged, right? Because of what was done to us, what was stolen from us, and what is continuing to happen by way of keeping us down when we have all the answers inside a book. Like they told us back in the day, bro, reading Rainbow, bro, take a look. It's in a book. But we want to get folks enraged to the point of taking action and for us to not go backwards, but to go forward.
I like that. Well said. I think now is a perfect segue into a question I've been wanting to ask before we even started recording. And that is, how do you feel what is intentionally happened to the Black bookstores? How do you feel that is impacted literacy, specifically among the Black community?
Karim, you talk about this one all the time. I'll toss this one to you, bro.
Well, you go back to this phenomena of the Black bookstore, as a safe space, places of learning. We look at the history of these bookstores when we focus on specifically during the era of COINTELPRO. They became these enclaves of radical thought, pursuit of intellectual prowess. A lot of the individuals and organizations that were fighting for freedom were chock full of authors that actually wrote books and actually utilized the chain of bookstores to actually have these books presented to the public. And so I do believe that they have actually served as anchors for our community because, quite honestly, when we do the research, many of the national bookstore brands, they're not carrying a lot of the titles that you'll even find in these bookstores. And so in terms of, finding factual history, from authors, first person account who have less to gain by really adulterating or revisionist history actually puts our people, that buy books from these bookstores in a better position to understand the truth of our existence, the truth of our history. A lot of this interesting, we had said earlier before we started recording, that this notion of literacy or the lack thereof in the United States of America has been on decline for like the last 20 years. And it cuts across race and ethnicity. It's not just Black people, who are reading less. And so there's a lot of dynamics that actually could be explored in this documentary. And, over the time, as we're in production and we're writing and we're sitting with these historians and these luminaries, a lot of these questions actually, are going to come up and we're going to really explore those facets. What in particular was the moment, in your development as an author, perhaps, during that period of time or as a student during that time that really changed the trajectory of your life, that you go from to someone that, watches the revolution that, wasn't televised on a limited basis to, someone that was spurred to actually getting out there and doing something personally. I mean, there's so many people that you hear, that have a relationship with books, have a relationship with reading. And especially when we talk about Black history, refer to the autobiography of Malcolm X. And they refer to that in a visceral manner. That it was something that actually really was a catalyst for what they sought to do with their life, at that time and what they sought to express. And so I just believe that you've got to look at it from a few different lenses. One, the challenge with literacy in America is not just a Black problem. We have a different relationship, with the actual physical word, that's actually rendered, on paper. We're doing less reading, with books, and we're doing more with screens and with gadgets, which actually does change the relationship to the actual written word. Yeah, I mean, I feel that's how I will answer that question. I believe that they have served as profound institutions and places, for us to actually acquire learning and knowledge specifically about us in a more of an unadulterated way, as opposed to, when you were in school and the information that we received really was not comprehensive, if you think about it, and a lot of times just wasn't true.
Bro, I would just add again, brilliant, bro. I would just add like two additional points. I think Karim said a ton there, which I won't reiterate other than, again, the one piece I will reiterate is that very intentionally, there is an attack on the essence of truth. Just to be clear, in all its facets, right? Not just Black history as truth, but there is wholesale banning of books. There's attack on history, any history that runs counter to this current sort of, administrations or sort of zeitgeist of white supremacist culture, there's an attack on truth, to be clear. And to your point, bro, about like, what does it, also mean about some of these institutions going away? For me, it's not just about access, right? Because again, as we'll detail in the project, the number has gone up and gone down, right? But there has been a core sort of collection of these Black bookstores, again, like Hakim's in Philly or Marcus Books in Oakland, right? Tons have never gone anywhere. Everyone's place in Baltimore, 30 years strong where I live, right? And so it's not just about access, but it's the awareness. And one of the core things that we want to bring attention to through this project is something that I always say as it pertains to our culture as Black folks, right? Not just in America, but across the diaspora, is that we got to recalibrate cool, right? Because that's at the core of your question as well. Like, how do we get reading cool again with our young people? Because when it's cool, they will do it. It don't matter what the technology, et cetera. We got to recalibrate cool. We got to recalibrate our culture. And so it's like when we do that, hip hop is like a massive paradigm for me in my life. And a lot of like, quote unquote, like old school hip hop guys that were known as lyricists, they are, they do their best to not be like the old hating ass old guy, right? Like, to get off my big brother in Atlanta, Sadiq Ali, who's a dynamic entrepreneur, grew up in the bookstores alongside of me. He always talks about like not being the old get off my lawn guy, because young people immediately tune that energy out, right? It's like, you got to come with the supportive energy. But be that as it may, there's definitely a subset of like high caliber lyricists, right? Like the KRS-Ones, the Talib Kweli's, like of the world, the Andre 3000s of the world, right? Shout out Outkast. They just made it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There's a class of MC that are like, you could tell these new rappers don't read because of the content of their material, because of their vocabularies. When you got a rapper like the Genius, right, aka the Jizza from Wu-Tang Clan, that has one of the largest recorded vocabularies in hip hop history, it's because this guy was a known reader. KRS-One, literally his nickname was the teacher's a known reader. And so that recalibration of cool, I think, is a critical element that Lil Willem will transcend, the distractions of the day, et cetera. Like that's going to be there. And we know that has impacted the ability, again, not just of Black booksellers, but booksellers in general, right? Because at the same time, Pyramid Books and Caribou was going out of business. So was B. Dalton. So was a large number of Barnes and Nobles. But for Black folks, who I'm most concerned with, we got to recalibrate our culture to where reading is cool. And then folks will go and seek out these institutions that have never left. Sankofa in Washington, D.C., right? On Georgia Avenue, across the street from Howard University. These folks have been there for over almost 25 years, and have not missed a day. And so we got to increase that awareness as we recalibrate the cool.
Man, I like how you said that. I do. I think that will translate to the younger audiences very, very well. Can you share an example, either from the documentary or just from your own research and knowledge, of where a bookstore shifted from being a place of comfort to a location for radical political organizing?
Yeah, no, I think there's a bunch of histories or a bunch of examples throughout history. And then, shout out to one of our project collaborators, Dr. Joshua Clark Davis, who's written extensively. And he actually just put out a new book called Police Against the Movement, which really chronicles, a really intentional sort of proliferation of the police state to not just surveil Black bookstores. That was just one sort of piece on this like evil chessboard, but like, how do we surveil, sabotage, and ultimately squash all manner of social justice movements, right? And so, a ton of the sort of bookstores that he identifies in that book were like spaces of just like radical thought and encouragement. And one of which we've already mentioned, that was Drum and Spear, right? That was co-founded by members at the time of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Or again, Paul Coates, his first, entry into the Black bookstore world, obviously Baba Paul is Ta-Nehisi Coates' father, but his first foray into the Black bookstore movement was via the Black Book, which was a bookstore that was in Baltimore. That was really, again, for him, all about raising funds to support political prisoners in Baltimore, right? During his time as a Black Panther. And so we have these examples, bro, of how these bookstores sort of started off, is like one piece of the mission, but, we're able to transition into something much larger and to serve a much deeper point. And one just like final thing that I will add in is like this whole idea, and I think Kareem was sort of barking up this tree a moment ago, of like these bookstores as like training grounds and really prepping folks to go out and be armed, during the civil rights movement. And for me, one of the things that I've been sitting with a lot, I was at a conference earlier in the summer. There was a speaker whose name escapes me, but essentially they spoke to this idea that the moment we're in right now is a new civil rights movement. See a lot of these memes and like, kind of like, in my opinion, sometimes like goofy conversations, like, what would you do? What would you do if you were, slavery, or like, I'm not my ancestors? It's just like a really wonky line of conversations. But in reality, we're actually in that moment right now. So what you do right now is actually what you would have done then if you found yourself in enslavement, or you found yourself coming of age in the 50s and 60s in the sort of heart and throes of Jim Crow, right? And so the speaker at this conference, brothers, really spoke to this idea that we are in a new civil rights movement, but we haven't been trained because we got comfortable based on the tracks that our forebears laid for us. And now we have, sort of entered into like and fully sort of embraced the get money era, right? Like, let's just chase the bag, right? That's a privilege that our forebears laid out for us. And now we look up and your ability to get the bag has now been hindered, and you've not been trained in any sort of way, shape, form, or fashion on how to movement build, on how to organize. And organically, that was the role that a lot of these bookstores played during the heart of the civil rights movement. They were, both, I think, intentionally and unintentionally training thinkers and organizers and those that would play critical roles in the civil rights movement. And now we find ourselves, right, of history repeating itself again, and us not really knowing that this is a familiar character. They look brand new to us, and we just sitting here kind of stuck on stupid, bro, because we've forgotten a lot of what has come before us. And so this is a really, really critical time. And I think because of that, our project really feels timely. It really feels important right now to, again, like remind folks that we got the juice. We've been had the juice. We've been here before. And what we have to do is that Sankofa thing, right? As the Adinkra symbol tells us, we got to go back and get it. We got to remember what we already know, what we've already done in order to carry this thing into the future.
Absolutely.
To that, I mean, there was a lot there to even process, but some of the things that came to mind, the earlier question, just in terms of the impact, of the bookstore, specific impact, or even this movement, in a sense that it's really introducing and reintroducing, this effort of lifelong learning, is an acknowledgement of where a large part of our population has dealt with like stigma when it comes to reading and an ability to really retain information, right? And I don't think it's something that's really talked about, quite honestly. And for those that actually are dealing with that, it becomes like a difficult conversation to have, because, you can easily feel like, I'm part of the less than. But if you have a difficulty in, say, staying with reading material for a period of time, you get real sleepy, when you read a book, and then, now you're saying or thinking something about yourself, because of that experience. And perhaps it doesn't lend to the encouragement that you need to finish that book. That's really real. The relationship that families and parents have with reading and books, and how they're able to actually transmute that relationship, to their children, and I can remember as a child, I mean, I don't know a more avid reader than my father and my mother. God, I'll forgive her sins, accept her in paradise. I don't know of any more avid reader. And unfortunately, when I was young, that was part of why I was a little turned off to reading, because of what the crucible that they put me through. Yeah, my mom made me read Mark Twain. You're going to read A Tale of Two Cities, and you're going to do a book report, and you're going to, have full comprehension, and maybe I'm going a little too far, but A Tale of Two Cities was like, that was a big book, and it was kind of hard to understand. I was as a youngster, but there were other books that they as well had encouraged me to read. As I think about it now, that even though at the time I might not have had the mental capacity to really retain or fully comprehend what those books really were, pointing to or reaching for, it's still there. Anything that actually we put into our minds and our brains actually is retained. And it's really interesting how you don't really know that, you're pulling on knowledge that actually is already resonant in what you've learned or what you've experienced, in earlier times. And so it was another interesting point in the conversation I had some time ago was, I see these people, they get on Zoom and they have this big library behind them, with 1,000 books. And you wonder, like, will you really read all those books? That question comes up. And my colleague said, it actually would be a good thing if they read all those books. But the fact that they have the books means that there's a potential for them to read those books. And so having this sort of ethos where, the attainment, of knowledge, a new learning, lifelong learning, has its benefits. And so I just wanted to share that, for those that, I had an incident when I was younger, and this probably added to the stigma, that I had about myself with my difficulty in really reading, dense material. And it was, unfortunately, it was a Caucasian lady. And I was reading out loud, and I was just reading and reading out loud. And she actually looked at me and says, "Are you reading out loud?" And it made me feel like there was something wrong with the way that I was learning, because she had a whole different idea about what, having an intellect, was. And it wasn't really encouraging. How many of those situations are people going to hear and feel like, wow, that happened to me, and that might have had an impact, on, what I felt about myself. And so, all these things are real and oftentimes not talked about. And so the way that, we actually come to encouraging our population, to increase, their learning is very important, how we do it. And so I believe that the film itself will be written and presented in such a way that it creates this welcoming mat, if you will, for lifelong learning.
Absolutely. Sadiq, earlier you mentioned that the purpose of this film is to do several things. And one of those words you used was enraged, I believe, get people enraged. With that said, during the research for this film, what was the most shocking piece of declassified information or firsthand account that y'all uncovered regarding the government's efforts to silence these bookstores?
Yeah, no, bro. Great question. Great question. I will say that the research is ongoing, right? And so we're uncovering new stuff all of the time. And, not necessarily shocking so far, but what I will say is what has been interesting so far. And again, a lot of this has come through our sort of, both subject as well as sort of our lead historian on the project, Dr. Joshua Clark Davis. What he shared and what we sort of saw during some of the, sort of FOIA requests and some of those sort of transcripts and pieces that were uncovered via the FBI during the surveillance pieces is actually a really interesting general portrayal of life during the civil rights movement as these agents surveilled the stores. And so what they uncovered a lot of times in their notes, which we have the receipts on and actual copies of, is, like very sort of mundane, pedestrian comings and goings, that these were folks that were just living because there was nothing subversive happening. And so in many of the records, you see like, hey, somebody just came in and they stayed for 15 minutes. They talked with the clerk and then they left. Like, there was no big, 30 guys dressed in all black met in the back room. It was more just like a really sort of telling and in some respects, like a very gentle and touching just portrait of Black life as folks just lived. And for me, that was both interesting as well as like a little heartbreaking from the perspective of oftentimes, and again, this has been sort of, I don't want to say made light of, but it has been extrapolated, this whole idea of driving while Black. But now that has been extrapolated into now we're just buying books while Black. We're just reading while Black. We are just driving while Black. We're just living while Black. We're just bird watching while black. We're just buying Skittles and iced tea while black ad nauseum, ad nauseum, ad nauseum. And yet and still there is a subset of our counterparts that wish to extinguish us even when we are doing the most human of things, including, again, buying books while black. And so, this sort of persistent drive to find error and criminality in the most, again, mundane and human of things that we do as black folks is both troubling and all too familiar, especially in this moment where, again, I think the drive of black independence is as loud and is as fierce than ever as we continue to just be reminded of the less than high level of value that some folks place on black life. And I'll just sort of leave it there.
If you want to, I can follow that just with anecdotal incidents. So one of the participants in the documentary is the now owner of Hakim's Bookstore, Miss Yvonne Blake. She really talks about the FBI surveillance and how her father, Hakim, actually, would see the FBI agents watching, his establishment, right? And that's something she said in the teaser, which is interesting, that the father would say, hey, if they would just come inside the bookstore, they would understand that we're doing something that actually, can assist them, in becoming better human beings, by reading these books. And so one of the things we had heard Dr. Joshua Clark even mentioned in the interview, which I thought goes along to what you said, what are some of the things that are the most shocking or, eye-opening, was that the agents themselves who were, tasked with these investigations became some of the most literate individuals about Black authorship, and content, because they were reading all the materials that were being provided to the Black stores. Now, I found
and looking for stuff while looking for stuff.
So they really, got to a place of really understanding, a lot more about, us as a people than they perhaps even bargained for. I found that to be really interesting. But I would also agree with Sadiq that there's going to be a lot more that's going to actually getting uncovered, as we're actually in the production, of the film itself, because much of this is actually going to be a journey, to really expose not only that, past, with the federal government, but other arcs and stories, the bookstores themselves, and how they have been so resilient over the decades. Hakim's bookstore actually caught on fire at one point, and had to actually be rebuilt, and now stands as a new edifice, with a re-energized client partnership and a client population that actually buys books, and they're stalwart in the community. So part of our effort is to actually utilize the bookstores or cast the bookstores themselves as a character, and to learn as much as we can about, what it is that actually makes those edifices special and unique. And so it is an ongoing journey.
I got to remain cognizant of that. I think I want the movie to be out for you guys because there's so many people that I want to share this with or show the movie to, even though it's y'all are still in research or still in production. I immediately think about all the Black student unions across America. I immediately think of just, the students that may be in a Black history class, whether it's on the high school level or collegiate level. And so I have to remain cognizant of that.
Soon come, brother. and which sounds like a great segue to this community involvement, but I feel like you getting there, like how folks can get involved. But
we getting there. Trust me, we getting there. But before we get to community involvement, background, and all that stuff, I do have one question, and that is, so, because you mentioned how the resilience of the Black bookstore, not the rise and fall, but the resilience. So for the communities that, let's just say the bookstore was unable to be resilient, it collapsed, unfortunately. What replaced these essential intellectual spaces for the good or for the bad?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because that has been a talking point and conversation that we've had with Baba Paul Coates and Baba Nati, and one of the key reasons that we sort of acquiesced in a sense, to reconsider the subtitle because it was really founded on a premise that was going to be difficult really to prove, the rise and fall. And what was said at the time was that bookstores are like, many businesses are in existence today, that bookstores open and bookstores have difficulties and bookstores close. And then other bookstores open, other people are encouraged and they pick up the mantle. And I believe that we're going to find that that's actually what has happened. When you think about pyramid bookstores, right? You think about Karibu as a bookstore, and then now Mahogany, right? And look at Sankofa. I believe that these bookstores really have planted like really deep seeds, like in the community. And then what we've seen is that the people that actually learn the most, from their experience in the bookstores, eventually became people that were, energized enough to actually take it on themselves and actually open bookstores. So I'm hopeful that answers your question, but that's what we've seen sort of like in the chain of history. When you look at Washington, D.C., and in that DMV area, I don't believe that there's any lack, of bookstores in a sense, or places where you can go and buy books, even though pyramid bookstores today really doesn't exist in the same way than it did, maybe a decade or 2 decades ago. And so we've found where the resilience comes from, within the people that they serve. And those people actually, are educated and they realize that there's a gap, that actually needs to be filled. I mean, you can go back and have conversations with Sharikiana and Karima and Haile Karima and, the work, that they've done probably over 3 decades, and they all and everyone as sort of a consistent theme that I've experienced with everyone so far that we've worked with is that they all knew Brother Hodari Ali, Sadiq's father, right? And they all talk about like his beginning and his pioneering efforts, right? And how they were young in the game, coming up and they really pulled from it. It was its own network in a sense, of community-based, educational enclaves. And so I believe that the resilience comes from community. As long as we continue to serve that community, they'll serve, as bastions, of knowledge, and places where, you can, really get the real, and now I believe we need to actually move into, well, what are we learning and how are we expanding that knowledge base? Today, the fight, for a freedom and independence looks a little bit different in some ways, right? I mean, right now, when you look at like the topic of mental health and how mental health is approached, in terms of modalities, right? We've moved away from this notion that the DSM itself, of the diagnostic tools used by, psychiatrists to understand what they're dealing with patients, is a book that actually does, in a sense, understand our population. And so there really needs to be an evolution and a revolution in our approaches, to modalities and interventions that actually serve our people, and so that knowledge and understanding is part of, what this Renaissance is actually about. And so, I'm currently reading a book by a Black author, a Dr. Kevin Washington, PhD, who wrote about Ubuntu psychotherapy. And it's a whole approach, to the use of sight, sound, and movement, when you're dealing with soulfully indigenous populations. And so, I mean, it has gone beyond, what we might have read, in the 60s to this place where we look at all of the social domains that really play a part in our existence as humans. That knowledge and that pursuit of knowledge needs to actually cut across all those domains. And we need to be writing into all those areas. We talk about, financial literacy, where you're talking about good governance. When you're talking about, telling the truth to the people, what is the journalist creed and how does that journalist creed actually fit inside of our responsibility, to tell the truth and not gaslight the public. But a part of that resilience, I see, and understanding that, it's a broad effort to create lifelong learning, but also to begin to put into all these different spaces our perspectives, as Black, soulfully indigenous people.
All right. So I think people naturally relate to people that they have somewhat of a connection with, right? And so what I would like, I'd like starting with Sadiq and then passing it to you, Kareem. I want to know your why behind. I mean, you kind of shared a little bit about it, but I want you to go in depth. I want you to go more internally, like each one of you personally. I want to know your why, the inspiration, and your passions, and what has led you to this very moment. I know that's kind of loaded and layered and broad, but I want all of that for both of you so that my viewers and my audience can really relate to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, bro. And again, just appreciate the conversation, man. Just very, very rich. You know, what I would say, you know, at a super high level, and I alluded to some of this earlier, is that as we got into the story and, you know, I was hit with the inspiration to do something to honor my father, somebody who, you know, had the honor, had the privilege, you know, had the good fortune, you know, to have for 29 years of my life, right? Before he transitioned in 2011. And so that initial inspiration was simply to tell his story, figure out a way to like honor him and just show appreciation for the work that he did to impact tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, Black folks, you know, in and around the DMV and across the country. Right. But as we got into that story, it quickly became apparent that my dad's story was only one piece of this larger story that was, you know, decades, if not like a full century long, as it pertained to the pursuit of knowledge of self and the proliferation of knowledge of self. And especially for Black folks in America, folks of African descent here in particular, rebuilding our broken self-esteem. And so that was a critical part of my coming of age, my rite of passage, working. You know, there's like an article floating around of me from the Washington Informer when I was like 10 years old, right? Which would be over 30 years ago, me barely peering over the counter. There's a picture of me in the newspaper and literally I'm like 10 or 11. I could barely see over the counter. And that's where I was. Like, that's where I grew up. And so, you know, I think it was both a combination of like the osmosis of being in that space, smelling the incense, listening to the Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders, right? Like in that space, that was a little bit of a time release capsule for me in order to sort of get to this point where it's like, man, now all of it is like fully coming to bloom and just like such a critical part of who I am, my worldview, and how I go about my work, both with my family as well as in community. And so all of that, brother, is built into my passion and like this impetus to not only wanting to tell my dad's story, but also further the legacy and do it in a new and exciting way, which ironically is kind of funny. And I've actually never said this to anybody, in that my dad was actually a journalism major. And so storytelling and writing actually was something that was like very, very near and dear to him. And then my mom, who helped my dad, right, who's still with us, helped my dad, shout out my Amuna Ali, helped my dad found Pyramid Books. And she was a film major. And both of them met at Howard University. So we have like all of this that's like mixed in the pot, my brother, that is now coming like full circle and just presented with just such an awesome opportunity to both tell this story sort of singularly and as a moment in time, but also push it forward. And as the bulk of our conversation has been about how do we not only push it forward, but bring folks into this new moment that we find ourselves in? How do we re-engage our young people? How do we get them excited about being of African descent and learning all that the depths of our history have to offer? Not just, right, as one of my homies, Davon Love, who's one of our sort of cultural and historical consultants on the project, co-founder of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle out of Baltimore, says, right, not only do we want to just like tell a great story, but as history, as a reference, but we also want young people in our communities at large to be looking at our history as a resource as well. Because oftentimes, right, we reference history, we look back at it, but we don't mine it for the jewels and resources and answers to a lot of what we see repeating itself in this present moment. And so like all of that, my brother, is mixed in and comes full circle for me and my identity as a father, as a husband, as a Black man in America, and just like doing my best to like leave the world better than we found it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, well, my why, it goes back to my progeny, my family. From as far back as I can recall, I always wanted to live a life, an exemplary life, where my family would believe that anything that they ever wanted to do, that they could accomplish. And so I've been living my life in that way from as far back as I can remember, and taking on entrepreneurial pursuits, becoming a media expressionist, creating documentary films, working in studios, everything that I've done up to this point. And I believe that it really has had the impact for them to today, being on the East Coast with my family, able to actually sit in the living room with two of my daughters and their husbands and watching this film teaser. They said niggas don't read, the Untold Power, of the Black Bookstore. And they're watching this, and this is something that's emblematic of what, their father's efforts have been for years. But beyond that, being a Muslim, obviously Karim Ali, I also understand and have been instructed that the actual first word that was revealed, to our prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, was the word Ikra, read, recite. It was the first word that he actually received from the angel Jibril. And that has its own significance, all on its own. And I'm really looking forward to being able to weave that understanding, if not from a religious perspective to put into the film, but more so from its real underpinnings, how reading, reciting, and the pursuit of knowledge really assists humanity in finding clarity. I believe that you can find the solutions to any challenge that we have in this life through, a process which involves really doing the deep research and using the akal, or the intellect that we've been given, to really get to what we call clarity. So my why is inside of establishing lifelong learning and the pursuit of healthy communities, throughout the world, certainly globally. I should say certainly locally, in cities and towns and families and communities, and then by extension, on a global level, really encouraging lifelong learning and health. And you can't get to, healthy communities if you're ignorant. Just quite honestly, you can't get there.
All right. One theme that has been a constant this whole hour has been community, specifically the Black community, but bigger than that, just community as a whole. So how can the community wrap their arms around you guys, support you guys, and help propel you guys forward?
Woo! We thought you never asked, brother. No, I'm just joking, man. No, this has been this has been an amazing conversation. Listen, we're not going to belabor this point. Listen, one of the core elements of the Black Bookstore was called out during our teaser has been community. There is no Black Bookstore without community. It is a cyclical, reciprocal force in that bookstores are for the community. The community must be for the bookstore in order for it to sustain. And in much the same way, we feel this project is here to represent that same sort of ecosystem, that same sort of symbiotic relationship. And with that, we felt that it would be only fitting, only right that we initially funded this project by going to our village, our communities, those folks that consider themselves both bibliophiles, cinephiles, as well as Afrophiles, right? So if you love books, cinema, or Black folks, we invite you to join in supporting, helping to bring the NDR project to life. And we have launched, hopefully by the time this airs, a crowdfunding campaign via the Indiegogo platform with a pretty both ambitious as well as we think highly realistic goal to raise $100,000 towards production to get us into the first phase of production to bring this project to life. Hopefully by this time, via the link in this episode, folks have checked out the teaser that represented our first sort of initial photography and initial interviews in order to present to folks a little bit of the vision for what we want to do with this project and to tell the story that we've been speaking about here for the last hour. And so we invite folks to again, Lord willing, check out the link that is attached to this episode, but follow us on IG at They Said NDR, or our beautifully recently relaunched website at ndrfilm.com, and to visit that crowdfunding campaign and to again contribute whatever is on your heart and really help us tell this story. That is a community oriented story. That, again, as we said at the top of this conversation, this is not our project. This is a divine project. The creator told us to bring this to the world, and Lord willing, we will be obedient. And we need you all to jump in and help us follow through on that obedience, so we can tell this story that, Lord willing, will reverberate throughout our community for many, many times to come.
Yeah. I want to encourage your listeners, our public, to become a part of our community. And there's a saying in the scriptures, in Islamic scriptures, to save one life is as if you've saved all of humanity, right? And if you think about what the pursuit of knowledge, intellectual pursuit, reading, by extension, learning, reciting, what it does by turning on, a person's ability to really language, what is inside of them, and as well contribute to the uplift, of a society. By extension, could be that one life that we actually ended up saving through our efforts. I believe that often we ask the question of ourselves, what could we do in this moment where we feel like we need to contribute, to an effort that resists, what we see in the world. And we believe that this is one of those ways that you can actually contribute, because this project, in a sense, is a form, of resistance. And so I like what Sadiq said, and I believe that it accurately depicts our thinking, in as much as we believe that the first step will be to come to our community, with what it is that we have on our hearts and our minds, engage those hearts and minds, and to helping us self-fund a project like this. This is a project for us, by us, supported by us. And so in that vein, we ask everyone to, open up their hearts and provide us with what you can. There'll be some that can do a lot. We accept that. And there's some that can, do a modest amount. But we look forward to everybody doing something.
If you love truth, go ahead, Brother Timothy. That's all I was going to say. If you love truth, we ask for your support. If you love Black folks, we ask for your support. There's one of my favorite African proverbs is that a single stick will smoke, but it will not burn. We need the community. We need a bundle of sticks to light this thing on fire, to create, that conflagration, that will take, that's a SAT where I learned that from reading, conflagration that will take this project into the future. So again, if you love truth, if you recognize that we are in a perilous moment and that we must control our own narrative, then we ask for your support in bringing this project to life. We getting it out the trunk, Timothy, like Master P and them, the No Limit days, baby. We getting it out the trunk. We taking it direct to the people.
And if you will, sign us off with the updated title and subtitle.
Karim?
They said niggas don't read. The Untold Power of the Black Bookstore.
Booyah!
Thank you, Karim and Sadiq.
Blessings to you, my brother. Thank you for having us.
Blessings to you, brother. Thank you so much.